Letizia and I'm the curator. I'm here in conservation with Larry Keith, our head of conservation, and Peter Schade, head of framing. Now, as the picture's nearing the end of its conservation treatment, we're beginning to think about how we might frame the picture and whether we need to acquire a frame or perhaps make a frame for the painting. We bought it without frame. It was a picture, as you remember, that was not restored and not framed. So in a way, we've got a sort of clean slate. We can start from scratch and see what works and what doesn't work without any sort of preconceptions.
So it's a really interesting moment that Peter's gathered together a variety of frames, and this is a chance to really see what works and get a sense about what works formally. And so we often nowadays can make very large-scale photographic reproductions. These happen to be taken before treatment started, but they're really useful for giving an indication about how the frame might work, and we can test them, much more happily than using the painting itself, which is here nearing completion. So I think Peter would like to say a little bit about the kind of frames we have and why they're here.
Yeah, we try to match historically kind of appropriate frames with paintings, and have a selection of a variety of Italian frames of the early 17th century, which give us everything from carved to black and gold to gilded to silver to wooden to brown painted. So there's a variety that we can all try out to see how tonally and how the shapes work with the painting. What's interesting, of course, this painting is almost square, and it'll be very unlikely that we find an old frame that would fit perfectly. So all these frames will also have to be considered with a view to adjusting the frame or using the frame as a model for reproduction. That's the options that we need to sort of discuss.
And in looking at this big variety of frames, we've kind of narrowed it down to at least two things we're most interested in. But it's interesting to think about how frames which are correct historically and appropriate sometimes just don't work with the painting. And that's the thing I find interesting, is there's a combination of knowing about the style and history of frames, and then we still, like in conservation itself, ultimately we're making nuanced aesthetic judgments which are up for discussion. So for example here, this frame, you can see that the carved elements, which are wonderful, have, in our view anyway, a slight unfortunate tendency to repeat or compete with the spikes on the Catherine wheel in a way that seems a bit distracting. And so we're inclined not to go with this frame for that reason, although it's perfectly appropriate.
It's got beautiful color and beautiful weight, and it's got the original surface, which is something that we find with frames, or we aim for. It's very good in all those respects. Also, it would be adaptable. That's something that I'm concerned about, that whether it's feasible to adapt an ornament. And this would be possible to adjust in size. But it actually really doesn't work well in this area.
And it's interesting, it's like there's no substitute really for just trying a one-to-one reproduction with the frame itself, because that's something that would be really hard to, I don't think we would have gathered that as much from just looking at an image. And so we're just playing with the things. You gain all sorts of insight, I think, into what works formally, what seems right, even though they all may be, historically anyway, kind of correct. With any frame around this painting, we've talked about the fact that the way she's composed it, with quite tight crop, it is really interesting to see, even with these photographic reproductions before conservation, you can start to see how the figure has more weight and how it emerges from the plane in really very convincing sort of way. But I find it fascinating to think about what happens with a darker value around the picture. Even though it's articulated with the gold, you get a sense, I think, of her kind of emerging even more powerfully from around the frame, yet without feeling too contained by it. But the gold has a beautiful kind of color and patination that's really nice, particularly with the cleaned picture itself. The less yellow, the cooler painting.
The cooler values of the clean picture work particularly well with the gilded frame.
And so at this stage, I mean, it's not that we're necessarily absolutely going to commit to one of these frames, but it's so useful to see in the round different families of frames and just get a sense about kinds of formal qualities that enhance, our view of the painting and how it's working.
This actually looks surprisingly insubstantial next to frames that are fractionally wider, but they're just, this looks very, very broken up. It makes the painting look less strong, I guess.
Yeah. It's such a subjective thing as well. I really don't like this finish on this picture. It doesn't work for me.
Yeah, it's a different kind of experience about how the relationship works between the figure and the frame. And it's not that one's right and one's wrong, they just have different qualities, and that's kind of the challenge and the fun of trying to work out what might serve the painting best.
You think about the sort of intrinsic importance of a frame. I think about it curatorially. Is it the kind of frame this picture would have been hung in? And also I'm thinking, is it something that proportionally in my work here, but then weirdly doesn't work in the gallery, in a very large picture gallery with many other pictures sort of competing for space in a way. So we have to kind of bring all those elements into our decision making. I agree with you with the black. I think the black really helps to sort of extend the picture rather than compress it. But actually I find that the fact that this frame is quite large works very well. It gives an importance to the figure, presence.
And it's as this has got kind of a reverse section, an inner section that projects into the room. Actually the painting sits almost or exactly at the same level as this black painted section, whereas here the frame actually pushes the picture physically outwards. So it's more of a reverse section, which is kind of a typical 17th century device, the paintings projecting forwards. I think especially portraits were framed in a way that would project them outwards into a room, rather than a frame that makes you look into a space where you kind of see a world with either a landscape or with a figurative scene. A portrait, I think, was always meant to be projected into the room.
And that's certainly what she's trying to achieve artistically with the way she's constructed the colors and the values and the modeling of the arm and the rest that I keep talking about.
And Peter, so with one or other of these choices, obviously they need to be adapted because they don't actually fit the picture, or we're faced with the decision of whether to use them as a model, perhaps to create something in the framing workshop here. I mean, perhaps you could talk through the pros and cons, particularly with the smaller one, which is a harder thing to adapt.
Yeah, that would be really, I mean, fortunately, I think the reproductions are not absolutely the right size, but I think I know that this size fits, I think in height or in width, at one dimension it fits pretty accurately. So that makes it at all possible. I think if the frame had to be adapted in two ways, then one could rule it out. But just adapting it one way is difficult but possible.
But I think it's worth saying that there are examples even now in the gallery where we think a historical model is appropriate for a picture, and some of them we can really reproduce very, very effectively.
Yes, this can also be
This is one of the kinds of frames, I think, because it's not a solid mass of 300-year-old gilding, basically, isn't that right? I mean, it's more easy to kind of make a more effective reproduction. You're smiling at me now.
No, of course, reproductions are possible, but they always, we always carry the kind of the baggage of modernity of our time, and that gets always, in some way, it transfers into reproduction frames. And usually we don't see it now, but we can look back at a history of frame reproduction in the gallery as well. And most reproduction frames, after 20, 30 years, they don't match up to originals.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, that 50 years from now you can always see. And it's the same thing about how decisions we make about restoration itself. You know, we try to be, I guess what we can say now is we're very transparent about the decision-making process, but it's definitely an interpretation all the way down the line. And so this is just another aspect of how, you know, we take a view about things, about display that is never written in stone.
But I think by using actual old frames of the time, even if we adapt them, there's a greater likelihood that they will stand the test of time.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true.
So looking at this one in particular, what would be challenging in adapting this frame?
Yeah, these Tuscan frames, they're quite common, but they're very, very hard to use. I think we've got very few in the gallery, but they are actually a reasonably common frame to find, partly because they're so difficult to adapt. And this one in particular, having to be extended in one dimension would be quite challenging to perform and yeah, basically it's to do in a way that is invisible, and invisible not only now but also in the long term. Sometimes extensions only become visible after 5 or 6 or 10 years when the wood has slightly changed in size, and then cracks appear where an extension has been made in the past. And that's also, you know, we select frames very much for the long term, for something that might be on the picture for forever as far as we're concerned.
Yeah.
And therefore we really have to think about it, especially with extensions, not to do something that will just look all right for now, but will become visible in the future.
It's twice as complicated with these kinds of frames, isn't it? Because if you make them bigger, you have to keep the ornament in the middle.
Yes, this
so
would
you
have
can't
to
just
be,
add to one side.
It would have to be extended.
Yeah.
In 4 places.
So technically, that's double the challenge and double the ethical issue, I would say.
And this can be reproduced very effectively. So if we want to go for this type of frame, we might have to consider reproduction.
Whereas the gold frame, that would be a matter of cutting that down, adapting it to make it smaller, and that would be more straightforward?
This would be fairly straightforward. We have enough substance to alter this frame so that it would be completely invisible, and all we would see would be original substance. We wouldn't have to add anything to this. And also there is no kind of ornament that would make this frame only work at this size. So this is quite adaptable.
Is it fair to say that this is the kind of frame that was even designed and conceived to be any number of lengths?
Yes, I'm sure this kind of frame would have probably been made in different sizes.
So we're not doing anything that they wouldn't have been thinking about in the workshop in the 17th century.
Yeah, it's more that our picture is just a really unusual size.
Yeah.
Yeah.